You will reconsider all of your previous late-night road trips after hearing what you are about to hear. The only channel that presents you with authentic horror stories that have been investigated, confirmed, and documented is Verified Fears. Welcome back. We're going to ride shotgun with America's truckers into their worst nightmares tonight, and I'm your host. Every night after 3, America's most remote routes are traversed by 5 million truck drivers. The rest of us will never see what they see. They come across individuals I hope we never cross paths. Additionally, some of them never return home. You are about to witness 11 first-hand descriptions of the most upsetting experiences long-haul truckers have ever experienced, all of which have been confirmed by police reports, press articles, and personal testimonials. These pastas aren't eerie. These aren't campfire stories or urban legends. Some of the offenders are still at large, and these are actual incidents that happen to actual people. The stories I'm going to tell have been verified by numerous sources and cross-referenced with official documents and police records. Verified. Worries are distinct because of this. All of the nightmares you hear on this channel are real. I need you to do something for me before we set out into the darkness. Verified Fears publishes the most terrifying true stories every week, so hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next, I promise. Click like if these stories make you shiver. It makes these confirmed accounts of actual terror easier for other horror lovers to find. Please share your own unsettling experience if you are a truck driver in the comment section below. Every story is looked into for possible upcoming episodes. Now get ready, because there won't be a way back once we go on this journey along America's darkest highways. On desolate patches of asphalt where assistance was hundreds of miles away. These 11 stories will put you inside the cab with drivers who confronted their darkest fears. Every nightmare is real here at Verified Fears. And narrative number 1 begins today. Let's get started with our first tale. And I have to warn you, this one will make you doubt all you believe you know about the roadways you drive. Danny Rodriguez, a seasoned truck driver with over 15 years of cross-country driving experience and no significant incidents, provides this report. Among his fellow drivers, Danny was seen as a non-spook. Easily someone who has seen it all and dealt calmly and professionally with whatever came his way. On a chilly February night in 2019, that reputation would be put to the test while traveling through Wyoming on Interstate 80. Due to weather delays, Danny was transporting electronics from California to Chicago, and he was currently nearly 2 hours behind schedule. He reached that especially barren area between Laram and Cheyenne just after midnight. If you have ever driven one, you are familiar with the scene where the wind howls across desolate plains and your headlights appear to be engulfed by the blackness. The road was so dangerous due to the light snow and the temperature dropping to -5 degrees that Danny had to limit his pace to around 50 miles per hour. It was then that he became aware of the convoy behind him. About 1/4 of a mile back, 3 trucks are running in perfect formation. Danny didn't give it much thought at first. For safety, especially during inclement weather, truckers frequently travel together. However, as the miles went by, something started to seem strange. No matter how Danny changed his speed, the truck stayed at that precise distance. They slowed down when he slowed down for a steep hill. They matched his pace exactly when he picked up the pace on a straight stretch. They appeared to be attached to him by an unseen thread. Danny cycled through the normal channels on his CB radio in an attempt to get in touch. "Hey, convoy behind me. You guys copy?" "Just static." He made another attempt on the unauthorized trucker frequency, channel 19. At mile marker 235, this eastbound motorist wants to talk to the 3 trucks that are pursuing me. Nothing has changed, not even the typical conversation you might anticipate from other nearby drivers. With the exception of the occasional burst of static that, if you listen closely, almost sounds like whispering whispers, the radio was entirely silent. As Danny ascended a hill close to the 240-meter marker, he was able to see the trucks in his mirrors for the first time. They were all older models. The design of their cabs and the way their headlights were arranged told him. They resembled trucks from the 1980s or 1990s, which are no longer commonly seen on the road. What struck him as peculiar was that despite the frigid weather and blowing snow, none of them had their running lights on, simply headlights cutting through the darkness like 6 shining eyes. When Danny realized he hadn't seen any other traffic for more than an hour, the uneasiness intensified. Even in the middle of the night, you would anticipate seeing a few cars or other vehicles on a major highway like I-80. Vehicles. But except from Danny and his enigmatic escort, the route was deserted. They seemed to be traveling through a universe in which everyone else had just disappeared. Danny chose to put his supporters to the test. At mile marker 250, he stopped into a rest area, assuming the trucks would either stop too or go on past him. Instead, with their engines running and their headlights still on, they slowed down and parked in a line at the far end of the rest area. In each taxi, Danny could make out the outlines of drivers, but they were motionless. They were just sitting there observing him. The restroom itself didn't feel right. Even though it was a significant stop on a busy road, it was empty. The lights in the parking lot were on, but they created odd shadows that appeared to move, even when there was nothing to move them. The structure. It was dark where the vending machines and restrooms were located. Danny went to it and discovered a homemade sign in weak handwriting that simply said, "Closed until further notice." It was tacked to the door. Danny made the decision that he didn't want to know what his supporters desired. Pulling out of the rest stop, he got back into his taxi and looked in his mirrors before merging back onto the highway. The three trucks promptly followed, reverting to their ideal alignment precisely 4 miles behind him. This went on for an additional 50 meters past tiny settlements that ought to have displayed traces of life, yet they seemed totally deserted. At about 3 in the morning, when events unfolded in a way that still gives Danny anxiety, his engine began to splutter as he approached a lengthy uphill incline. He smelled burning coolant as the temperature gauge started to rise near the red zone. Any truck driver will tell you that it's not simply an inconvenience to lose your engine in the middle of nowhere in below freezing temperatures. Inconvenience. It might result in death. Before it died completely, Danny was able to persuade his truck to climb the incline. His hazard lights flashed as he rolled to a stop on the shoulder. None of the 3 trucks that had been pursuing him stopped. They didn't even reduce their speed. At standard highway speed, they sped by him, and as each passed, Danny had his first unobstructed view of the drivers. He could not explain what he saw. Every taxi seemed deserted. The driver behind the wheel is not visible. Inside, there was no movement. Either something Danny couldn't see was driving the vehicles, or they were driving themselves. Danny saw something that chilled him to the bone when the 3rd truck went by. He recognized the name of the company painted in fading letters on the rear of the trailer, Freight Company Westbound. Having read about that moniker in trucking journals, Danny was familiar. He was familiar with it. In the 1980s, Westbound Freight was a modest trucking business based in Wyoming. In 1987, the business closed after 3 of its drivers vanished in a blizzard. There was no sign of the men's whereabouts when their trucks were discovered abandoned on Interstate 80. Danny watched the taillights of the 3 freight trucks heading west fade into the gloom as he sat in his lifeless truck. He knew he could have an hour before hypothermia became a serious problem, because the temperature in his cab was already decreasing. There was no signal when he tried his cell phone. He heard something that made his skin crawl when he tried his CB radio once more. He could hear voices conversing faintly over the static. 3 men talking about their delivery schedule, the weather, and the state of the roads. Except for one thing, the talk sounded normal, even ordinary. The voices discussed truck stops and road conditions that had altered decades earlier. As if it were still open, they brought up a truck stop in Cheyenne that had been destroyed in the early 2000s. They talked about staying away from a construction site that Danny was aware had been finished 15 years prior. Then Danny's heart stopped when one of the voices spoke. "At mile marker 285, we have a driver who is broken down. Shall we return to assist him?" "No, let him," said another voice. The 3rd voice chuckled like a wind roaring through a cemetery and continued, "He'll be joining us soon enough anyway." Danny became increasingly horrified to learn that they were referring to him. "Freeze. We've got a schedule to keep." These phantom drivers somehow knew exactly where he was and what was going on with him. The radio crackled once more, as though in response to his thoughts, and one of the voices addressed him directly. "Danny, don't worry. Once you get acclimated to it, the cold isn't as bad. The winter evenings no longer annoy us after 37 years of traveling these roads. Danny noticed headlights coming up behind him at that precise moment. Instead of the constant beams of typical headlights, there are erratic, flickering lights that appear to dance in the shadows. The 3 trucks were heading back toward him, traveling at highway speed along the freeway in reverse. As they drew nearer, Danny saw that the trucks themselves didn't appear right. They had rusty and fading paint. Even though their engines were working, their chrome was tarnished, and their windshields were covered in ice crystals. Danny heard a door crash as the lead truck came to a stop right behind his trailer. In the direction of his cab, footsteps crunched through the snow. However, Danny saw no one walking when he checked his mirrors. At his driver's side door, the footsteps halted and someone knocked. The cold air resonated with 3 slow, purposeful knocks. A voice, muffled by the wind but yet discernible, shouted out, "Friend, there's an engine problem. We are able to transport you." There was something strange with the voice, even if it seemed nice enough. Something that reminded Danny of frostbitten lips and frozen vocal cords. We have extensive knowledge of these roads, been at the wheel of them for longer than most people have lived. Danny remained silent. All of his instincts from his 15 years of truck driving were telling him not to open that door. He sat motionless, gasping for air, and hoped that whatever was outside would give up and go. This time the knocking was more persistent. Additionally, the voice yelled out once more, "Come on, Danny. Don't be rude. We know you're in there, and we know you're getting mighty cold. Open up and we'll get you warmed up real nice." Danny's cab's temperature was dropping, and he was clearly puffing. He knew that his enigmatic guests were correct, and he was beginning to shake violently. The cold wouldn't hold him for long, but he had a feeling that it would be much worse than freezing to death to accept their assistance. Danny heard another engine coming from the east at that moment. As the phantom convoy came up behind a Wyoming state trooper, real headlights, warm, steady, and normal, pierced the darkness. The 3 trucks that had been following him were illuminated by the emergency lights of the patrol car as Danny stared in his mirrors. However, Danny could see that the vehicles had changed in the strobing red and blue light. They remained the same age, models, but they now had the appearance of ones that truly belonged in a museum. They had entirely faded their paint. Every surface was covered with frost, and their tires were damaged and flat. The most unsettling thing was that he could see the seats beyond through the cab's windows. There was no doubt that the vehicles were empty. The PA system of the trooper came alive. "This is Wyoming State, and the driver of the disabled car officers. Is everyone okay in there?" Never in his life had Danny been so delighted to hear another human voice. After grabbing his CB radio, he replied, "I'm okay, officer." The engine overheated, but Danny checked his mirrors again and saw that 3 trucks were gone, disappeared entirely, as though they had never been there. For the following 2 hours, the troopers assisted Danny in restarting his truck. Danny's entire engine breakdown should have been prevented by a straightforward fix involving a leaky coolant pipe. Danny informed the officer about the 3 trucks that had been after him while they were working. The trooper waited for Danny to finish his story before responding. The cop then remarked something that has troubled Danny ever since. This is not the first time a driver has reported seeing freight trucks traveling west on this section of roadway. Every year, we receive maybe 3 or 4 reports about drivers breaking down near a mile sign, always during winter storms. 285. Oddly enough, we looked into the initial departure of those westbound drivers in 1987. Discovered their trucks in this precise location, with the heaters going and the engines running. However, the interiors of the cabs were as frigid as if they had been left unoccupied for days. After starting his vehicle, Danny made his car go to Chicago without any more problems. However, he has never again traveled that section of I-80 through Wyoming, particularly not during the winter. His cross-country runs now take 2 extra days as a result of his choice to a southern route. However, Danny argues that avoiding eternity in a convoy of dead truckers is worth the 2 extra days of driving. It's not just Dai's experience that is the most unsettling aspect of this tale. The Wyoming State Police said that they have records of 17 incidents of this nature during the previous 32 years. The Phantom westbound freight convoy reportedly approached the 17 drivers that broke down at mile marker 285. 3 of the 17 drivers were never seen, once more. Similar to the original westbound vehicles, their trucks were discovered in the same state. Cabs frozen solid, heaters on, motors going, and no sign of the drivers. Although Officer Mitchell Thompson, who assisted Danny that evening, retired from the police 6 months later, the police will not formally comment on the disappearances. He made a statement in his retirement interview with the local newspaper that gives this story a final twist. Some spirits aren't satisfied with simply haunting, and some roads retain their ghosts. They are constantly seeking drivers to join their convoy as they continue to work on their routes. Now let's tell our second tale, and this one demonstrates how even the tiniest errors may lead to the most horrific experiences. This story was provided by Lisa Patterson, a long-haul truck driver with 8 years of experience who took great satisfaction in knowing every major route in the nation like the back of her hand. Because of her extensive knowledge of interstates, truck stops, and shortcuts that most drivers never use, Lisa was the type of driver who could navigate from Seattle to Miami without ever using a GPS. Found. On a sweltering August night in 2021, Lisa was traveling her customary route along Interstate 40 to transport furniture from North Carolina to Texas, when she encountered unforeseen construction close to the Tennessee-Arkansas border. She was feeling optimistic about making an early delivery and ahead of schedule. Due to an overturned chemical tanker, the roadway was fully closed, and traffic was rerouted into a number of back roads that would eventually lead to roadway 67 South. Since Lisa had already taken this detour about 2 years prior, she wasn't especially worried. The path would get her past the construction and back on schedule, but it would add nearly 40 miles to her journey. She was unaware of how much the area had changed since her last visit due to rural development and road building. In fact, the detour signs she was following were remnants of a prior construction project that ought to have been taken down months earlier, and new roads had been constructed while old ones had been abandoned. Lisa had been driving on narrower country roads for more than an hour when she realized she was lost. About 20 minutes prior, her CB radio was only picking up static, and her GPS had lost signal. There were no signs indicating which way led back to civilization, and every turn seemed to lead to another unmarked intersection. The roads she was going on weren't even marked on her trucking atlas. There was something unnerving about the surroundings that Lisa couldn't quite identify. Most of the moonlight was obscured by the tunnel effect created by the thick, overgrown trees on each side of the road. Something about what she could see in her headlights didn't seem right. Farm homes that seemed to be their yards were overgrown and their windows were smashed, yet their driveways still had new tire prints. Fields that were covered in dead vegetation that appeared to have been burned or poisoned, while in late summer, they should have been covered with crops. Lisa immediately wanted to go back to the interstate and turn around. However, a semi-truck couldn't do a U-turn on the narrow roads she was on. She would have to locate an open area or a crossroads big enough to move her rig. As she went on, she started to realize she was passing the same landmarks over and over again as she searched for a location to turn around. A red barn with half of its roof missing, a dead tree with characteristic twisted limbs, and a rusted mailbox styled like a cow. Lisa initially believed she was simply confused and that similar-looking features appeared to be identical due to the rural surroundings. However, she realized something was very wrong as she passed the cow-shaped mailbox for the 4th time. She had been driving for 2 hours after exiting the freeway, based on her odometer. However, she was strangely following routes that should have taken her in a straight line, in a loop. Lisa made the decision to inquire for directions at the next house that appeared to be inhabited. She took great satisfaction in the fact that she had never needed assistance while traveling, but her ego was less essential than getting home safely. A tiny white farmhouse with a porch light on and what looked like a television flashing through the front window was the first residence she saw. Lisa approached the front door after pulling into the gravel driveway. The television sound instantly stopped when she knocked, but nobody answered the door. Lisa was positive she saw activity through the glass and could see that the lights were on inside. "Excuse me, I'm a truck driver and I'm lost. Could you help me with directions?" She knocked louder this time as she got closer, but there was still no answer. But Lisa could hear what sounded like whispering coming from inside the house, and as she turned to go, she noticed something that made Lisa hurried back to her truck and continued down the road. But each house she passed had the same pattern: lights on, signs of recent activity, and a sandbox full of sand, dead insects, and what appeared to be small animal bones. The front yard was littered with children's toys, a tricycle, some dolls, and a sandbox full of sand. But the toys were covered in a thick layer of dust and dirt, as if they had been left outside for years. The feeling of being watched was getting stronger by the mile. Lisa kept checking her mirrors, but there was never any traffic behind her, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that she was being followed, that something was pacing her truck just out of her headlights. However, no one answered the door when she knocked, and all of them had children's toys in the yards, toys that appeared to have been abandoned for years but were arranged as if children had just finished playing with them. On multiple occasions, she believed she saw movement in the tree line, shapes too big to be animals, but moving in ways that didn't seem quite human. At around 2 in the morning, Lisa saw the first person she had seen since leaving the interstate, a middle-aged woman, standing in the middle of the road, lit by Lisa's headlights, wearing a white nightgown that was smeared with what appeared to be dried blood or mud, and she wasn't moving, wasn't calling for assistance, and wasn't attempting to get. She simply stood there, staring straight at Lisa's truck. Lisa slowed down and stopped approximately 20 feet away from the woman, rolled down her window and yelled, "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you require assistance?" The woman continued to stare at the truck with an expression Lisa later characterized as hungry, as if she were watching at a food truck, but she didn't answer, didn't even recognize that Lisa had spoken. A meal, rather than a human, and after a few minutes of attempting to talk to her, Lisa chose to drive around her cautiously. But as she started to move, the woman moved too, always putting herself right in front of the truck, and it became obvious that she had no intention of letting Lisa pass. The woman's movements were odd and out of character. She would move from one side of the road to the other without seeming to take steps, and her feet never seemed to touch the ground. Lisa made the decision to back up and take a different route, but when she checked her mirrors and put the truck in reverse, she saw that she was surrounded by more people, at least 6 of whom were standing motionless and staring at her truck, with the same hungry expression. Lisa also noticed that her truck's engine was running rough. The RPMs were wildly fluctuating, and she could smell something burning. The figures around her truck started to move closer, closing the circle, and Lisa could see their faces more clearly in her headlights now. Her oil pressure was dropping, and her temperature gauge was rising toward the red zone, as if the truck itself was being affected by whatever was happening on this road. Lisa had maintained this truck meticulously for 3 years, and it had never given her any trouble, and the mechanical failures were too sudden and severe to be coincidental. Their eyes were completely black, with no pupils or irises visible, and their skin was pale and waxy, like melted and reformed candle wax. When their mouths opened, Lisa saw that their teeth were sharp and pointed, like a shark's teeth, but arranged in human jaws. In a desperate move, Lisa slammed the engine and drove directly toward the woman in front of her truck, hoping to either scare her into moving or, if necessary, push through. The other figures, however, melted away into the darkness as if they had never been there, and as the truck drew closer, the woman just disappeared, not jumped away, not moved aside, but simply disappeared like smoke. Lisa's truck roared back to life, and all the mechanical issues vanished as quickly as they had appeared. She floored the accelerator and sped down the road, oblivious to the steep hills and tight turns, focused only on getting as far away from those figures as possible. After 20 minutes of driving at dangerous speeds through the winding roads, Lisa heard what sounded like screaming coming from the trees on both sides of the road, following her as she drove. She almost cried with relief when she saw a sign indicating that she was approaching Highway 67. She followed the signs and found herself back on a major road with normal traffic and working streetlights. Her GPS picked up a signal again right away, and her CB radio crackled back to life with a familiar chatter of, the dispatcher was courteous, but seemed unsurprised by Lisa's story, taking down her information and the approximate location where She got lost and then telling her something that still gives her nightmares. "Ma'am, you're the seventh driver this year to report getting lost on those roads and encountering people in nightgowns." Lisa called the Arkansas State Police after stopping at the first truck stop she found. The dispatcher continued by explaining that the area Lisa had driven through was the previous location of a small rural community called Millfield, which had been abandoned in the 1970s after a chemical plant explosion contaminated the groundwater. The entire town had been evacuated, and the government had eventually razed all the buildings and let the forest reclaim the land. However, truckers, hikers, and other travelers continued to report encounters with the former residents of Millfield, people who seemed to be unaware that their town no longer existed. "We can never find the roads that drivers describe, and our maps and GPS systems show nothing but dense forest." Lisa never traveled that route through Arkansas again, even when construction was underway, after learning that the chemical plant explosion had occurred at night while most of the town's residents were sleeping, that over 200 people had died from chemical exposure, most of them found in their beds in pajamas and nightgowns, that the contamination had been so bad that the bodies couldn't be moved for weeks, and that by the time cleanup crews arrived, many of the victims had been changed by the chemicals in ways that the official reports describe only as significant physical changes to deceased individuals. The encounter itself isn't the most unsettling part of Lisa's story. She's also noticed that other truckers who know the area avoid talking about those back roads, and when pressed for details, they quickly change the subject. It's as if there's an unwritten agreement among drivers that some places are best left undiscovered, and some roads lead to destinations that no living person should visit. However, what transpired next? 3 weeks later, Lisa received a package at her home address, marked by a post office that had been closed since 1978 and lacking a return address. Inside the package was a child's doll that was exactly like one of the toys she had seen in the yard of the first house where she had stopped for directions. The doll was wearing a tiny nightgown that was stained with the same dark substance she had noticed on the roadside figures. Underneath was a faded ink handwritten message that said only, "Thank you for coming to Millfield. We hope to see you again soon. We are constantly seeking new inhabitants to join our community, and we receive very few visitors these days." Lisa threw the doll away right away, but the following morning it was back at her door. She burned it in her backyard, but a week later she got another package with the same doll and the same note. The note was signed with dozens of names written in various handwritings, as if the entire town had contributed to the message. She has been getting a new doll every few weeks for more than 2 years, and even though she has moved twice since the first incident, the packages still managed to find her. Lisa continues to drive long distances across the nation, but she has installed several GPS units in her truck, keeps thorough maps of every area she passes, and participates in online trucker forums where drivers exchange information about roads to avoid. She has also learned that her experience in Millfield is not unique. The last detail that makes Lisa's story particularly chilling is what she found when she looked into the postal records for the post office that had allegedly mailed her the dolls. Official records show that the Millfield post office had processed its last mail delivery on the day before the chemical plant explosion in 1973. There are dozens of similar communities across rural America, towns that were abandoned or destroyed but still exist in some form, inhabited by residents who refuse to accept that their time has passed. Let's move on to our third story, and this one involves something that every trucker depends on but rarely questions. The Postal Service has no explanation for how or who is creating these letters, but they are still delivered because technically the addresses are legitimate and the postage is correct even though the stamps being used were discontinued decades ago. Facilities report that they still occasionally receive outgoing mail with Millfield postmarks, always addressed to truck drivers who have reported getting lost in the area. CB Radio. This story is told by veteran driver Marcus Thompson, who in March 2020 was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix. Marcus had been driving the same CB radio for more than 12 years, a dependable Cobra 29 that had never failed him and had been his constant companion through many lonely nights on the road. At approximately 11 p.m., Marcus was traveling through a particularly desolate stretch of Interstate 40 in New Mexico when his CB crackled to life with a transmission that instantly caught his attention. This is your Shadow, eastbound driver in the white Peterbilt. You've got a problem with your left rear trailer tire. Better pull over and check it before you have a blowout. Marcus glanced in his mirrors, but there were no trucks behind him, and the highway was completely deserted in both directions, which wasn't unusual for that area at that time of night. The voice was clear as day came through on Channel 19. The description was accurate because it was Peterbilt, but Marcus couldn't understand how someone could see his truck when there was no other traffic in sight. Nevertheless, no trucker takes tire safety lightly, so Marcus pulled over at the next open spot and briefly inspected his trailer. Using a flashlight, Marcus walked around his trailer and found that his left rear tire was in fact developing a dangerous bulge on the sidewall, the kind of defect that could cause a catastrophic blowout at highway speeds. Marcus keyed his CB radio and sent out the following message. "Hey, Shadow, this is the white Pete you warned about the tire." Marcus was thankful for the warning, but he was also perplexed as to who had given it to him and how they had been able to see his truck so clearly when he couldn't see them. "You were spot on. I appreciate you alerting me to my severe sidewall bulge. Where are you running?" The response was prompt. "Don't worry about where I am, driver. Just focus on getting the tire changed safely. You've got about 40 minutes before that sidewall gives out completely." The warning's accuracy was unnerving. Marcus had seen plenty of trucks in both directions. "You'll want to double-check those lug nuts. The third one from the top is still loose." Marcus worked to change the tire, and the voice on the faux radio continued to provide commentary and guidance. It was almost impossible to predict exactly when a sidewall would fail, even for experienced mechanics. However, there was something about the voice that conveyed absolute certainty, as if the speaker had somehow already witnessed the tire failure and was working backward from that knowledge. During the hour it took to change the tire, the enigmatic CB operator started sharing details about Marcus's life that no stranger should have known. "How is your daughter Sarah doing with her nursing program? There's a state trooper about 15 miles ahead running radar, so keep it under 70 when you get back on the road." All of the information the voice gave turned out to be utterly true. Sarah was in fact a nursing student at a university 800 miles from home, and Marcus had never mentioned his daughter on the CB radio. "That chest pain you've been having, you really should see a doctor about that when you get home," the voice went on. "It must be difficult to have her so far away at school. Contrary to what you keep telling yourself, it's more than simply heartburn." For weeks, Marcus had been having sporadic chest pain, but he hadn't told anybody about it, not even his wife, blaming it on stress and bad truck stop food. However, the worry, and as Marcus was about to get back on the road after changing the tire, the voice on the radio suggested something more serious. "Shadow, I really appreciate all your help tonight. What's your handle? Maybe we can stay in touch." After a long pause, the voice said, "My handle used to be Knight Rider, but I don't use that." The voice sounded hesitant to explain the accident, so Marcus inquired. "Hadn't used it since the accident." After a few minutes of hesitation, the voice finally said, "Happened right here, Marcus. Same stretch of highway, same time of night. Tire blowout at mile marker 127. Lost." Marcus felt a chill go down his spine as he heard a voice claiming to be that of a dead trucker, someone who had died in the exact kind of accident that Marcus had just avoided. He wanted to brush it off as someone making a cruel joke. "But let me see, that was about 6 years ago. You'll notice the cross marker when you pass mile 127. It's a white cross with some plastic flowers that my wife put there. At mile marker 127. Marcus's headlights illuminated a white wooden cross on the highway side, exactly where the voice had predicted it would be. Plastic flowers faded by years of weather were attached to the cross, and Marcus pulled over and walked to the marker where he found a small metal plate with an inscription. "Thomas Knight Rider Williams, 1962 to 2014. Beloved husband and father. Keep I'm always out here, Marcus." This highway, it holds on to some of us. I couldn't help myself that night, but maybe I can help other drivers avoid the same fate. Marcus's hands were shaking as he keyed his CB radio one last time. "Knight Rider, are you still out there?" he asked. Clearly, but with a sadness that seemed to reverberate across the desert. The radio went silent after that, and Marcus never heard from Knight Rider again. However, 3 days later, Marcus made an appointment with his doctor, and the tests showed a serious heart condition that required immediate surgery. His cardiologist said that Marcus would have probably suffered a massive heart attack while driving if he had ignored the symptoms for even a few more weeks. Take care of yourself and get that chest looked at. Your daughter needs her dad around for a long time. After doing some research, Marcus learned that Thomas Williams had actually worked as a truck driver before he was killed in a single vehicle collision near mile marker 127 in 2014. With more than 20 years of experience behind the wheel, Williams was well known among other truckers for his eagerness to assist other drivers with road advice and mechanical issues. His wife attested that he was operating a CB on a route from Detroit to Phoenix at the time of the accident, and that his CB handle had been Knight Rider. The fact that Thomas Williams had passed away precisely 6 years before to Marcus's meeting with The Voice on July 1st, Channel 19, was the most unsettling detail he learned. On the yearly anniversary of his meanwhile, truckers alleged to the New Mexico State Police that someone going by the name Knight Rider on mile marker 127 warned them about potential dangers on the route. Over the years, the alerts have avoided scores of accidents and are always correct. Marcus continues to travel that road on a regular basis, and as he passes mile marker 127, he pays close attention to his CB radio. Knight Rider never got back to him. However, he has heard from other trucks who have received identical warnings in the same location. That section of roadway has come to be known as the Knight Rider's Beat by the trucking community. And a lot of drivers take the time to express gratitude to the guardian spirit that keeps an eye on their fellow truckers long after their own trip is completed. Every trucker has encountered a circumstance like the one in our fourth story, deciding whether to take up a hitchhiker or not. This story was provided by Angela Rivera, a driver with 9 years of experience who had a strong personal rule against picking up strangers. Numerous times, that policy saved her life. However, it was nearly broken by what appeared to be a harmless run-in on North Dakota's Highway 2 during a severe snowstorm in January 2022. When the storm struck with a force, Angela was traveling east toward Fargo while carrying a load of farming equipment. Her 60,000-pound truck was being pushed sideways on the roadway by the wind, which was screaming across the plains with such fury that visibility nearly vanished. When she noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, Angela had reduced her speed to around 30 mph and was thinking about stopping to wait out the worst of the storm. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s and was dressed only in trousers and a flimsy jacket that was totally inappropriate for the freezing temp. She was merely standing there in the blowing snow, 10 feet away from the road, without actively attempting to flag down cars. Road. Initially, Angela wanted to continue driving. She had never violated the company's stringent policy against picking up hitchhikers. But for some reason, Angela changed her mind after seeing this girl standing naked in a lethal blizzard. After pulling over approximately 50 yards outside the girl's position, Angela remained in her idle truck for a few minutes, contemplating her options. The outdoor temperature was 20 degrees, but the wind chill made it feel even colder. Without adequate shelter, no one could endure those conditions for very long. At last, Angela made the choice that most likely saved their lives. Since the next town was approximately 40 meters away, she made the decision to at least give the girl a ride. After putting the truck in reverse, Angela backed up to the girl's position. It is risky to be outside in this weather, so she pulled down her passenger window and said, "Hey, do you need help?" With what seemed like sincere relief, the girl glanced up at Angela and appreciation. She was young, blonde, and attractive, but she was shivering excessively, and her lips were already blue from the cold. I was about a mile back when my car broke down. Over the wind, the girl yelled, "I've spent over an hour walking in search of assistance. Are you able to transport me to the next town? You can get paid by me." After another moment of hesitation, Angela, the passenger door was unlocked. The girl hopped into the cab, carrying with her the fragrance of something Angela couldn't quite place and a rush of cold air, something like flowers that have been submerged in water for too long, sweet and cloying. My car slid off the road, into a ditch, the girl said, identifying herself as Jennifer. She claimed that although she had attempted to contact for assistance, her phone had died, and the storm was becoming worse every minute. Angela was sympathetic to her and was happy that she had chosen to assist. Jennifer assured that she would just require a ride to the next truck stop. where she could call someone to come get her, and she appeared courteous and appreciative. Angela tried to talk to someone to kill time as they drove through the storm. However, Jennifer's answers were odd and inconsistent. Jennifer responded, "Around here," when Angela inquired about her origins. However, she was unable to identify any nearby towns or landmarks when asked for specifics. When Angela inquired about her family, Jennifer replied that she had been seeing relatives but was unable to recall their names or their residences. Angela started to worry about Jennifer's actions. Jennifer wasn't warming up, even after standing in below freezing temperatures for more than an hour. Jennifer's lips were still blue, and she was still shivering despite the truck's heater being turned on full blast. Jennifer's skin felt freezing to the touch when Angela brought her a blanket from her sleeper berth, as though the cold had seeped into her so deeply that she couldn't be warmed by artificial heat. Something that made Angela sick to her stomach caught her attention around 20 meters down the road. Despite the poor visibility and hazardous road conditions, she could see another set of headlights following them in her side mirror, maintaining a steady distance. The following car also slowed down as Angela did. It matched her pace when she accelerated a little. After years of traveling, Angela had learned to trust her gut, and this situation seemed like a setup. Angela made the decision to investigate her suspicions. She informed Jennifer that she needed to verify her load securement at a weigh station that was approaching in a few miles. Jennifer's response was startling and quick. She grew furious and urged that they must continue driving since it would be risky to stop during the storm. "No, we can't stop. They're waiting for us to stop," Jennifer exclaimed, grabbing Angela's arm with unexpected power after she clarified that it would only take a few minutes. Jennifer only gazed out the passenger window and said something about having to keep going when Angela asked who they were. Angela became aware that Jennifer's respiration was irregular at that point. She could not feel her chest rising and falling as it should. Upon closer inspection, Angela saw that Jennifer was not breathing at all. There was no misting of the glass, no discernible breath in the cold air. Angela felt the understanding as if it were a bodily blow. Jennifer was dead. There was something completely different in her passenger seat. Something that was trying to get Angela's cooperation and trust by leveraging Jennifer's beauty. Angela struggled to maintain a neutral expression as her thoughts whirled through her possibilities. Something inhuman was seated 3 feet away from her while she was alone on a deserted roadway in a blizzard. Angela chose to comply while she devised a strategy for getting out. She kept going in the direction of the she had mentioned a truck. "Stop." However, Jennifer grew more upset as they approached. She continued to grumble about them catching up while gazing into the mirrors. At last, Jennifer turned to face Angela, her face no longer human. When she smiled, Angela could see that her teeth were pointed and sharp, and her eyes had turned entirely black. Jennifer's tone was one of, "You know what I am, don't you? Not quite human anymore. We've been hunting this highway for 3 winters now. I stand in the cold to attract the sympathetic ones, the drivers who can't resist helping someone in distress. Then my friends follow us until we reach the truck stop. I can smell your fear. It's delicious." Angela's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to keep driving steadily toward the truck stop. Jennifer went on talking, and what she said next explained everything. An isolated location where they can take the truck and the cargo. "Normally we let the drivers leave afterward, but lately we've been feeling more hungry." Angela acknowledged that she was being led into a trap and that the headlights following them belonged to Jennifer's accomplices, but she also recognized that Jennifer had made a critical error by disclosing that there was an afterword for some drivers, meaning that not all of their victims were killed right away. Ignoring her protests, Angela pulled into the truck stop parking lot, driving straight toward the main building where the lights were brightest, and Jennifer made her final threat. "If you don't drive away from here right now, I'll kill you where you sit." Angela chose to make her move at the truck stop where there might be other people and security cameras. As they got closer to the truck stop, she noticed that it was well lit and seemed to be open, with several other trucks parked in the lot. Jennifer grew more agitated, insisting that they needed to get to a more private location. But Angela had noticed something significant. Jennifer had not touched the door handle since she had entered the truck, and she did not appear to be able to operate any of the truck's controls, and whatever Jennifer was, she seemed to be subject to some sort of rule that prohibited her from hurting Angela while they were in the truck or on public property. Angela pulled up right in front of the main entrance of the truck stop and started honking her horn repeatedly right away, and in a matter of seconds, other truckers and truck stop staff were coming outside to see what the emergency was. Angela yelled, "This isn't human," and pointed at Jennifer. "She has been attempting to trick me." The temperature in the cab instantly returned to normal, and the sweet, cloying smell that had been bothering Angela vanished instantly after Jennifer's shriek broke both of the truck's side windows and then simply disappeared like smoke, without opening the door and running. The other truckers assisted Angela in calling the police. Even more unsettling was what the police found when they looked into Angela's route. A car in a ditch about a mile from where Angela had picked up Jennifer was in fact there, but it had been there for more than 6 months. The security camera footage from the truck stop made it clear that Angela's truck had pulled up and that she had gotten out, but it showed no passengers at any point. Angela was the 4th trucker in 2 years to report picking up a hitchhiker, who fit Jennifer Walsh's description on that same stretch of highway during winter storms. In each case, the drivers reported being followed by mysterious vehicles and feeling as though they were being led into a trap. The 3 previous drivers had all escaped by stopping at public stops. The car was registered to Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old college student who had vanished during a blizzard the previous winter, and her body was discovered frozen solid in the vehicle, still wearing the same jeans and thin jacket that the hitchhiker had been wearing. Angela discovered that Highway 2 through North Dakota has one of the highest rates of missing trucker cases in the nation, with over a dozen drivers going missing without explanation in the last 5 years. Local law enforcement believes that there is an organized group using supernatural bait to lure truckers into isolated areas, but they have never been able to catch the perpetrators or determine exactly how they are operating. Angela still drives that route occasionally, but never during winter storms, and she has added more security cameras to her truck. However, 2 other truckers had vanished entirely on that highway during that time period, and their trucks were discovered abandoned with no sign of the drivers. The last terrifying detail of Angela's story is what she learned when she looked into the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh. Police reports state that Jennifer was driving to visit relatives when her car went off the road during the blizzard. She has also joined a network of truckers who share real-time information about suspicious activity on dangerous routes, and most importantly, she has never again considered breaking her rule about picking up hitchhikers, no matter how desperate their situation appears to be. But here's what keeps Angela up at night. Jennifer Walsh was traveling west when she crashed, but the hitchhiker, posing as Jennifer, had been standing on the eastbound side of the highway, luring drivers back toward the scene of her death as though she was attempting to retrace her route in the opposite direction. Our 5th story addresses a common nighttime anxiety among truckers, the fear of not really knowing what you're hauling. Veteran driver Carl Matthews, who had been driving cross-country for 15 years, shares this story. Carl took pride in his professionalism and dependability, and as the type of driver that businesses trusted with their most sensitive and valuable shipments, he was selected for what appeared to be a routine but lucrative job. In September 2021, his dispatcher called him about a special delivery that required complete discretion involving the transportation of a single shipping container from a private warehouse outside of Memphis to a research facility in Colorado. The pay was extraordinary, nearly 3 times his usual rate. The only conditions were that Carl could not open the container at all, that he had to drive through it without stopping for long periods of time, and that he could not talk to anyone about the cargo. The pickup location was unusual from the beginning. Rather than a typical loading dock, Carl was led to a remote warehouse complex about 30 meters outside of Memphis, which was surrounded by high fences and security cameras, and appeared more like a government installation than a commercial shipping operation. Men in dark suits checked his identification several times and had him sign a number of documents. The container itself was unlike anything Carl had ever hauled. It was a typical 20-foot shipping container on the outside, but it had been heavily modified with additional locks, reinforcement plates, and what looked like a ventilation system. Most disturbing of all, the container had what appeared to be motion sensors attached to the exterior walls and temperature monitoring equipment. The men loading the container were very methodical and careful, using specialized equipment to secure it to Carl's trailer, and they insisted on testing the restraint system several times and provided him with a sealed envelope with his delivery instructions, which he was instructed not to open until he was 50 miles from the pickup location. Since Carl had previously transported classified government cargo, the security measures didn't frighten him, but something about the entire operation felt different, more urgent, and more secretive than usual. Carl started traveling toward Colorado, and for the first few hours, everything seemed normal. The container was balanced and didn't affect his truck's handling, and he traveled well on the interstate highways. However, as evening drew, Carl started to hear odd noises coming from his trailer. Carl tried to brush off his worries, telling himself that the container was meant to be sealed and that he was probably just hearing highway noise or mechanical sounds from his truck. But as he listened more intently, he noticed that the noises seemed rhythmic and deliberate, as if something was moving around inside the container intentionally, rather than rolling or sliding like loose cargo. Carl heard what sounded like scratching or scraping against the container's interior walls, always from the same spot near the front of the trailer, and the scratching would go on for a few minutes, then stop completely, then start up again with greater intensity as darkness descended. At around 1000 p.m., Carl started to worry that there might be an animal trapped inside the container, but the shipping documents made it clear that the cargo was research materials and made no mention of livestock. While doing his routine safety inspection at a truck stop in Kansas, Carl noticed something that made his blood run cold. Tiny droplets of what looked like blood were leaking from the container's bottom seal. It wasn't much, just a few drops, here and there, but enough to create little puddles underneath the trailer. Carl's first instinct was to call his dispatcher, but the confidentiality agreements he had signed specifically forbade him from contacting anyone about the cargo, except in the event of a major emergency. So he wasn't sure if a few drops of what might be blood constituted a serious emergency, especially since the container itself seemed safe and undamaged. So Carl chose to keep driving, but he kept his cell phone handy in case he needed to call for help and his CB radio tuned to channel 19. The scratching sounds from the container persisted throughout the night, sometimes getting loud enough for Carl to hear them over the noise of the road and his engine, and what was even more unsettling was that the sound seemed to react to outside stimuli, getting more frantic whenever Carl changed lanes or applied the brakes, as if whatever was inside the container could sense the trucks around 3 in the morning. Carl was traveling down a remote stretch of the Colorado highway when his truck's motion sensors started to detect movement on the trailer. It wasn't just the typical vibration of driving, but a clear motion as if something heavy was moving around inside the container. This experience still haunts Carl to this day. In order to investigate, Carl pulled over at a rest area. However, as soon as the truck came to a complete stop, all movement inside the container ceased. The scratching sound stopped. The motion sensors returned to normal, and everything became eerily quiet. Carl's truck had a sophisticated load monitoring system that could detect cargo shifts, and the sensors indicated that something weighing about 200 lb was moving freely inside the supposedly sealed container. Flashlight. Then he found something that made him doubt everything he had assumed about his cargo. Human handprints on the outside of the container, pressed against the metal from the inside so forcefully that they had left visible impressions on the outside walls, concentrated around what would have been an adult's eye level, as if someone had been trying to push their way out of the container, and most unsettling of all, they seemed fresh with traces of moisture that looked like human skin condensation or sweat. As soon as he heard the voice, which was muffled and distorted by the container walls, Carl realized that he might have been misled about the nature of his cargo and that he might be involved in something illegal or dangerous. Carl tried calling his dispatcher, but all he got was a message stating that the number was no longer in service. Carl immediately called the emergency number he had been given for the shipping company, but the phone rang endlessly without an answer. Out. Aid me. Help me, please. I have no idea where I am. Don't leave me in here, please. Like someone who had been stranded for days without food or drink, the voice was feeble and frantic. I'll get you out of there. Tell me how many people are in the container with you, Carl called out in an attempt to reply. He was completely chilled by the response. Only 3 of us remain. They didn't make it, but there were more. Hurry up, please. We're running out of time. Carl became aware that he was carrying abducted individuals, some of whom had already perished in transit. He informed Colorado State Police of his position and circumstances right away by dialing 911. After 20 minutes, the rest area was encircled by police and emergency vehicles, and a dedicated hazmat team got to work safely opening the container. What they saw inside was inexplicable and went against everything Carl believed to be true about his cargo. With the exception of an advanced climate control system and what looked to be medical monitoring equipment, the container was absolutely empty. The container contained no living or dead persons, but there was signs that it had recently been occupied. In one corner were food wrappers, personal items, and what seemed like homemade beds. Worst of all, vital signs were still being recorded by the monitoring apparatus inside the container. 3 different people's heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain activity were measured. There was no one inside the container, but the medical readouts indicated that 3 persons were alive and conscious. People who couldn't be seen or located were being detected by the apparatus. The results of the police inquiry showed that a shell corporation with ties to illicit human trafficking activities had employed Carl, but the company vanished entirely following Carl's arrest. There was no sign of the men who had loaded his vehicle, and the warehouse where he had picked up the container was discovered deserted. Strangest of all, there was no evidence that the container had ever been there. The shipping paperwork Carl had been given were highly skilled forgeries, and the serial numbers were phony. After detectives verified that Carl had been tricked and coerced by the trafficking organization, he was ultimately exonerated of any misconduct structure, but the lawsuit was never resolved. Furthermore, it is still unclear what happened to the people whose voices Carl heard and whose vital signs the monitoring apparatus picked up. According to the FBI, Carl might have unintentionally interfered with a paranormal human trafficking scheme that makes use of technology that is beyond the realm of contemporary science. Following the incident, Carl immediately withdrew from long-haul trucking and is currently employed by a local delivery service that only handles confirmed freight with complete openness regarding its contents and destinations. Additionally, he has turned into an advocate for the safety and rights of truckers, speaking at conferences about the significance of when something doesn't feel right, follow your gut and know what you're hauling. 6 months after the tragedy, Carl's story takes a turn for the worst. A USB drive featuring video footage from inside the container during his voyage was delivered to his home without a return address. 3 individuals, 2 men and a woman, are seen in the video being confined within the container. However, the video's timestamps precisely match the moment when the cops discovered the container was empty. In the video, individuals are yelling for assistance and specifically addressing Carl, pleading for him to stop and release them. Carl gave federal authorities the USB drive, but they haven't been able to provide an explanation for how the film was made or the current whereabouts of the individuals shown in it. The FBI continues to receive allegations of truckers being hired for similar enigmatic deliveries involving sealed containers and abnormally high pay rates, and the investigation is still ongoing. According to them, Carl's story is only one example of a much bigger scheme that still takes advantage of the trucking sector for objectives that can go much beyond traditional human trafficking. We reach one of the most recognizable locations for any long-haul truck driver on our 6th floor. The truck stop is open 24 hours a day. These locations are meant to be secure and routine. Therefore, this driver, Rebecca Santos's experience, is all the more unsettling. With 11 years of professional driving experience, Rebecca was familiar with almost all of the main truck stops between California and New York. She therefore believed she had just stumbled onto a newly opened location when she parked into what seemed like a brand new facility on Interstate 70 in Missouri. The time was 2:30 a.m. Rebecca noticed the truck stop signage promoting Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, next exit, and all services accessible on a Tuesday in October 2021. Despite the fact that new facilities were constantly opening and the signage appeared authentic and professional, Rebecca had drove this route dozens of times and had never seen this specific truck stop before. Rebecca decided to check it out because she needed nourishment and a rest. From the highway, the truck stop looked quite regular. Bright lighting, a spacious parking lot that can accommodate huge rigs, and a contemporary main structure that has a standard restaurant and convenience shop layout. Even though it was far after midnight, Rebecca saw that the fuel island was crowded when she pulled in. Everything appeared to be going according to plan as other lorries moved through the lot and filled up. When Rebecca started filling up her truck, she saw that the diesel price was far less than what she had been paying at other stations. It is less expensive than the national average, at nearly 40 cents per gallon. We keep our prices low to build customer loyalty. Once you stop here, you'll want to come back. The attendant who came out to clean her windshield grinned when she stated this, and something about his tone made Rebecca a little uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, but she chose to go inside for some coffee and food since she valued the savings. The truck stops inside was excellent. It was modern, clean, and well-stocked, and even though it was late, the restaurant area was offering hot food. Quite a few other trucks were inside, Rebecca saw. While some are dining in the restaurant, others are perusing the aisles of stuff, and still others are simply enjoying coffee while sitting in the seating area. Rebecca found it strange that everyone was so silent. The typical trucker camaraderie and conversation that you would anticipate at a busy truck stop was absent. Kind middle-aged woman rang up Rebecca's goods as she gathered her belongings and went to the checkout desk. Will you be staying with us tonight, as we have excellent sleeping facilities, and many of our customers find that once they rest here, they don't want to leave? The clerk asked Rebecca as she was processing her payment. Rebecca graciously declined, stating that she would rather sleep in her own truck, but the clerk's response was out of the ordinary. At first, they all say that. However, big gyms have a way of winning people over. Rebecca started to notice things that hadn't registered when she first arrived as she made her way back to her pickup. Almost like they were sleepwalking, the other truckers in the parking lot were moving extremely slowly and methodically. A number of drivers were only standing next to their trucks, looking into space and doing nothing useful. Other drivers either ignored Rebecca's attempts to wave or establish eye contact, or they gave her blank looks that seemed to see right through her. Rebecca made the decision to depart right away. However, nothing happened when she got into her truck and attempted to start the engine. Every one of her electrical systems was operational: dashboard, radio, and lights. However, the engine refused to start. By the time she got to the truck stop, Rebecca had been driving this vehicle for 3 years without experiencing any mechanical issues, and it was operating flawlessly. She made a few more attempts, but the engine was still dead. Rebecca returned inside to inquire as to whether there was on duty as a mechanic. Additionally, the clerk who had previously served her appeared unsurprised by the issue. "Oh," she remarked nonchalantly, "that happens sometimes. Some engines are impacted by this elevation. Our maintenance crew can examine it in the morning, so don't worry. Why don't you take a nap in the interim? We offer incredibly cozy sleeping quarters." Rebecca emphasized that she asked if anyone could take a quick check at her truck because she had to get back on the road. The clerk sent her in the direction of a man named Jim, who was sitting in the restaurant area sipping coffee. This man was most likely the large Jim after whom the truck stop was named. Jim, a big gregarious man in his 60s, gave Rebecca a warm greeting and offered to show her her truck. Jim spent roughly 15 minutes inspecting Rebecca's engine after following her out to the parking lot. He asserted that a loose electrical connection was the cause of the issue. Rebecca's engine started right away after little tweaking under the hood. She expressed her gratitude for the assistance and offered to reimburse Jim for his time. But he declined. Money. He smiled, but it was not quite visible. "Just remember us when you're driving through again," he murmured. After thanking Jim, Rebecca got ready to go. However, she discovered something that really unnerved her as she was doing her pre-trip examination. All of the trucks in the parking lot were modified in the same way. She didn't identify the small electrical instrument that was fastened to the engine compartment. Upon careful inspection of her own truck, she discovered that Jim had fitted a similar gadget when he was resolving her electrical issue. Although Rebecca had no idea what the device was, her instinct advised her to leave this truck stop right once. She swiftly exited the parking lot without turning around after carefully taking the gadget out and throwing it in the trash can. She looked in her rearview mirror as she was leaving and noticed something that supported her assumptions. She was being followed along the highway by a convoy of trucks that were leaving the parking lot behind her. Rebecca drove as fast as she could safely go, but the truck convoy followed her for a than 50 miles at the same speed. Separation. She attempted to report the incident to other drivers using her CB radio. The radio voices all sounded lifeless and flat, and the only answers she got were vague statements like, "You can't leave Big Jim's and come back to the plaza where you belong." Such is when someone speaks against their will. By taking an unexpected detour and traveling through a number of back roads until she arrived at another truck stop that she knew was authentic, Rebecca eventually lost her following. She made an instant call to the police to report what happened to her. However, she ran into trouble when she attempted to give the address of Big Jim's 24-hour plaza. There was no truck stop at the Interstate 70 exit, based on her GPS and trucking atlas. Before Rebecca showed them the electronic device she had taken out of her truck, the cops were courteous but doubtful. The cops summoned in experts from the Missouri State Police to examine it because they had never seen anything like it. The gadget rotated, turned revealed to be an advanced control and tracking system that could keep an eye on and turn off car engines remotely. Investigators were unable to identify the manufacturer of the equipment, which was significantly more sophisticated than anything that was sold commercially. The next day, authorities carried out an inquiry after Rebecca gave them thorough directions to the truck stop. The concrete foundations of a truck stop that had been dismantled more than 20 years prior were discovered on an empty lot. According to local documents, a building known as Big Jim's Plaza had operated there throughout the 1980s and 1990s before closing down for good in 1999. Following the death of its owner, James Big Jim Morrison, in a trucking accident. Rebecca was not the first driver to report seeing the phantom truck halt, according to additional research. At least 8 identical allegations of truckers claiming to have stopped at Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, but later learning that the establishment didn't exist had been sent to Missouri State Police over the previous 15 years. Each driver reported experiencing technical issues that were inexplicably fixed by a kind man named Jim, and a number of them mentioned discovering unidentified electrical equipment fastened to their trucks. The most alarming finding was that 3 truckers who claimed to have stopped at the phantom truck stop later vanished while traveling through Missouri. Their trucks were discovered abandoned at different points along Interstate 70, with no sign of their whereabouts or drivers. In each instance, traffic cameras had captured the missing truckers passing the exit where Big Jim's Plaza was supposed to be. Rebecca avoided that portion of Interstate 70 by altering her usual route. However, 6 months following her incident, the postcard was postmarked from a Missouri post office, but when Rebecca contacted postal authorities, they had no record of the postcard being processed through their system. Rebecca shared her story with other truckers through online forums and found a troubling pattern. Drivers who reported the incident said, "We miss you at Big Jim's. Your sleeping room is still available whenever you're ready to come home." The investigation into Big Jim's Plaza is still ongoing, but authorities have not been able to explain how multiple truckers can have nearly identical experiences at a location that does not exist. The FBI has classified the case as a potential fraud operation involving advanced technology, but they have found no evidence of fraud. Truckers who encountered the phantom truck stop frequently received similar postcards and phone calls encouraging them to return. Several truckers reported that their GPS systems would occasionally try to route them to the non-existent truck stop, displaying directions to Big Jim's Plaza even when they were hundreds of miles away from Missouri. Evidence of who could be running such a scheme or what their ultimate objective might be. Rebecca is still a professional driver, but she has installed several backup GPS systems and keeps paper maps with her to avoid using electronic navigation. She has also joined an unofficial trucker network that exchanges information about suspicious truck stops and strange experiences on the road. Most importantly, she has learned to fully trust her instincts and doesn't ignore any feeling that something is off, no matter how normal it seems on the surface. According to newspaper accounts from 1999, James Big Jim Morrison, the original owner of the truck stop, died when his truck's brakes failed on a steep grade and he crashed into a bridge abutment. The accident report stated that Morrison's truck had been equipped with an experimental electronic braking system that malfunctioned, resulting in the fatal crash. The apparatus that Rebecca discovered attached to her own truck was similar in design to the device that could remotely control. This story from driver James Mitchell will help you understand why some truckers develop superstitions about certain types of cargo. James had been driving for 13 years and had specialized in hauling high V-value items that required extra security and careful handling, artwork, antiques, and collectibles for auction houses and private collectors. It was lucrative work that paid well above standard freight rates, but James found that some cargo comes with a price that can't be ignored. Be measured in dollars. James was hired in November 2020 to ship a collection of antique furniture from an estate sale in Savannah, Georgia, to a private collector in Portland, Oregon. The shipper, an elderly man named Harrison Blackwood, claimed to be selling off his late father's estate. The furniture was said to be from the 1800s and included a number of bedroom sets, dining room furniture, and what Blackwood called a very special armwire that has been in my family for generations. James arrived at the pickup location, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of. When Blackwood met James at the door, he immediately struck him as an odd character, very pale, soft-spoken, and insistent that the furniture be loaded in. A very specific order with the armwire placed at the very front of the trailer. The loading process took the majority of the afternoon because Blackwood insisted on personally supervising every piece as it was moved from the house to James's trailer. The house was surrounded by overgrown gardens and seemed to loom over the landscape despite the bright afternoon sunshine. James found himself shivering every time he handled the items directly, even though they had been sitting in a house without air conditioning on a warm Georgia day. The armoire Blackwood had mentioned was especially unnerving. It was a huge piece, almost 8 feet tall, made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And it was ornately carved with figures that looked like angels and demons intertwined in various poses. What unnerved James was that the carved figures seemed to change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. Blackwood insisted that the armoire be kept locked during the journey, and he gave James a very specific warning. Under no circumstances should you open this piece or allow anyone else to examine it. The lock is there for everyone's protection. James had previously transported valuable antiques and was used to security requirements, but something in Blackwood's tone suggested that the James started his cross-country trip late in the afternoon, intending to drive through the night to make up time, and for the first few hours, everything seemed normal. However, as darkness descended, James started to hear strange noises coming from his trailer, which he initially thought were the result of normal furniture shifting and settling, but as he listened more intently, the sounds became noticeably unsettling. When James pulled over at a rest area around midnight to check his load securement, he discovered that several of the smaller furniture pieces had moved from their original positions despite being properly tied down with heavy-duty straps, and the condition of the armwire was even more unsettling. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, like someone moving around inside the trailer, and they sounded like wood creaking and groaning, but not from temperature changes or vibrations from the road. The great piece was still in place, but the lock Blackwood had been so worried about was now hanging open, and James was positive that the lock had been locked when they loaded the piece, and that it could not have opened by accident during transportation. James walked carefully up to the armoire, and he saw that the carved figures on its surface seemed more prominent in the dim light of the rest area, their expressions more sinister and realistic. James made the decision not to look any further, and swiftly resecured the load before returning to the road. But the noises from the trailer persisted through the night, growing louder and more unsettling. Around 3 a.m, while driving through a remote area of Arkansas, Exaton James heard something that caused him to immediately slam on his brakes and pull over. From his trailer came the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming, not a short cry, but a prolonged, agonized scream that seemed to come from inside the armwire itself. James started to hear what sounded like voices, muffled conversations coming from inside the armwire, as if multiple people were trapped inside and trying to communicate with one another. After a few minutes of listening in his idle truck, the trailer had gone completely silent. Dead James tried calling the Portland auction house that was supposed to receive the furniture, but they had never heard of Harrison Blackwood or any scheduled furniture delivery from Georgia. James was starting to suspect that he might have been misled about the nature of his cargo and the legitimacy of the delivery. So he sat in his truck trying to decide what to do when he noticed James saw that the temperature around his truck was rapidly dropping despite the mild Arkansas weather, and he decided to keep driving and call the police at the next major town. However, as he was about to pull back onto the highway, he heard a voice calling his name from his trailer. James also noticed that the arm wire, which was placed near the front of his trailer, where he could see it through his rear window, seemed to be rocking back and forth slightly, as if something inside the massive piece was trying to get out. Clearly, a young woman's voice said, "James, please help us. We've been trapped in here for so long. Please open the door and let us out." James disregarded the voice and drove on. But the cries persisted all night long, and he heard voices from men, women. The voices were especially unsettling because they knew specifics about James's life, including his wife's name, his home, and his preferred trucking route. By dawn, James was exhausted and afraid, but he was determined to get to a major city where he could get help from law enforcement, and children, all pleading to be freed from the arm wire. They said they had been trapped for decades, some for more than a century, and they described the interior of the arm wire as a place of endless darkness and cold. In Oklahoma, the voices from the arm wire grew more persistent and menacing, describing how they would follow James home and torture his family if he didn't let them go. The voices also started to interfere with the electronics in his truck, causing his radio to tune to static-free stations, his GPS to show locations that were impossible, and his engine to randomly lose power for a few seconds at a time. James pulled into a truck stop in Oklahoma City and called the police right away. James was waiting for the police when he noticed that other truckers in the parking lot were giving his truck a wide berth. A number of drivers came up to him to check on him, saying that they could hear screaming coming from his trailer and that the temperature around his truck was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. When the police arrived and opened James's trailer to check the furniture, they discovered something that was inexplicable. All of the furniture had moved from its secured position and was now arranged in a perfect circle around the armoire, as if the pieces had repositioned themselves during transportation. The armoire itself was standing open, revealing an interior that seemed much larger than the exterior. Police discovered dozens of personal belongings, jewelry, photos, clothing, and identification documents from the 1800s inside the armoire, all of which belonged to people who had been reported missing over the previous 150 years, many of whom were from the Savannah area. What was most disturbing was that the items showed no signs of deterioration or age, as if they had been preserved in some sort of temporal bubble. The Victorian mansion where James had picked up the furniture and Harrison Blackwood were investigated in Savannah. They found that the house had been abandoned since 1987, when Harrison Blackwood, Sr., the last known occupant, vanished under mysterious circumstances, and that the current owner, a property management company, had been trying to sell the house for decades, but had failed to find buyers because of reports of paranormal activity. The arm wire had a documented history of being linked to disappearances, and historical records revealed that it had belonged to a wealthy Savannah family in the 1850s, and that more than a dozen people had vanished while the arm wire was in their possession. The item had been sold and resold multiple times over the years, and each owner had abandoned it after experiencing supernatural phenomena. Police confirmed that James had been misled about the nature of his cargo, and he was released without charges. The furniture was taken into evidence and later given to a group of paranormal investigators who focused on haunted objects. The armoire and the other pieces were eventually destroyed in a controlled burn, but witnesses stated that the James retired from long-haul trucking immediately after the incident, and he now works for a local delivery company that only handles verified cargo with full documentation. James has also become an advocate for truckers' safety, often speaking about the importance of confirming the legitimacy of shippers and cargo before accepting unusual or high-paying loads. The most disturbing part of James's story is what happened to the man who claimed to be Harrison Blackwood, who police were never able to find or identify. Security cameras at the Savannah mansion showed James arriving for the pickup, but they did not show any other people on the property at any time. The video evidence showed that James was loading furniture alone while speaking to an unidentified person. 6 months after the incident, James received a package in the mail that included a small wooden figurine that was carved in the same style as the armoire's decorations. The figurine looked remarkably like James, and a note that said, "Thank you for your service," was attached to it. The collection keeps expanding, and dependable transportation is constantly necessary. Postal authorities did not have a record of the box being processed through their system, even though it had a postmark from Savannah and no return address. Our 8th story deals with one of the most basic assumptions we make about the world: that time passes in a straight line, and that if you keep driving, you'll eventually reach your destination. James keeps the figurine locked in a safe deposit box at his bank, but he reports that sometimes late at night he gets phone calls from people who say they're trapped and need transportation to join the collection. But when he tries to call the numbers back, they're always disconnected. James believes that he was specifically targeted because of his reputation for handling valuable and unusual cargo, and that other drivers may have also been victims of similar supernatural shipping schemes. Patricia Williams, a seasoned driver with 16 years of experience who took pride in her dependability and punctuality, was known in the industry for her ability to deliver any load on time, regardless of weather, traffic, or mechanical issues. Her reputation would be put to the test in ways she never could have predicted when, in March 2022, during what began as a routine delivery run, Patricia received a call from her dispatcher regarding an urgent delivery that needed to be completed. Within a very tight time frame, the cargo was medical. Patricia's truck had the climate control systems needed to maintain the exact temperature requirements for the sensitive equipment, and the pickup proceeded smoothly at a modern pharmaceutical facility outside of Columbus. The cargo consisted of several large crates containing what the shipping documents described as experimental diagnostic equipment worth over $2 million. The crates were loaded with extreme care by technicians wearing protective suits, and Patricia was given very specific instructions about maintaining temperature and avoiding any sudden movements or vibrations that could cause the equipment to break. The equipment was being transported from a pharmaceutical company in Ohio to a research hospital in Nevada, and the shipper was willing to pay premium rates for expedited delivery. The cargo was time-sensitive and had to reach the hospital within 72 hours to be used in an experimental procedure scheduled for the next week. So Patricia started west on Interstate 70, intending to drive straight through to Nevada with only short stops for fuel and required rest breaks, knowing she could easily meet the deadline because she had made similar runs before. For the first 8 hours of the trip, everything went smoothly. The equipment was working flawlessly, and Patricia was actually ahead of schedule when she entered Illinois at about 1,000 p.m. That's when she came across something that would test everything she believed she knew about time and space. She was driving through a particularly unremarkable stretch of Interstate 70 near Effingham, Illinois, a straight flat section of highway that she had driven dozens of times over the years. Patricia made good time through Ohio and into Indiana, keeping her trailer at the proper temperature and keeping an eye on the cargo status using an advanced tracking system that the pharmaceutical company had installed. Patricia saw that she was getting close to mile marker 159, which only registered in her mind because she had to record her location every hour in her logbook, but she was surprised to see it approaching again after driving at a steady 65 mph for what seemed like at least 10 minutes. Thinking she had misread the first marker, Patricia kept driving. But when she passed it for the third time, she realized something was seriously wrong. The area was rural farmland with few landmarks, just mile markers showing her progress westward. Patricia pulled over and checked her GPS systems, which had 3 separate units installed in her truck for redundancy, and all 3 devices displayed her location as mile marker 159 on Interstate 70 in Illinois. The GPS indicated that she was traveling west at highway speed, but her position was not changing, and the devices showed that her truck was moving along the highway, but no matter how far she drove, she stayed at the exact same spot. Patricia attempted to call her dispatcher to report the situation. Patricia was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a single mile of highway that seemed to repeat endlessly, but her navigation equipment malfunctioned. Her cell phone showed no signal, even though she was in an area where she had previously had good coverage, her CB radio was receiving only static, and even her satellite communication system was unable to establish a connection. At first, Patricia thought she might be having a medical emergency, a stroke, or a seizure that was affecting her perception of time and space. So she pulled over and Patricia conducted a thorough self-assessment, checking her vision, coordination, and mental clarity. Everything appeared normal, and she felt fully alert and oriented. There were no signs of any mechanical or electrical issues with her truck systems, so she decided to keep driving and see if the issue would go away on its own. However, after an hour of steady travel, she was still passing the same mile marker, 159, every few minutes, and the scenery around her remained unchanged. It felt like she was driving through a loop of highway that connected to itself, creating an endless circle with no way out. The psychological effect of the repetition was more unsettling than Patricia had expected, and she started to recognize every detail of the landscape. A red barn with a missing board, a dead tree with distinctive twisted branches, a rusted farm, implement abandoned in a field, the same farmhouses, the same grove of trees, the same billboard for a local restaurant, etc., looked exactly the same, as if time had stopped for everything but her truck. Patricia tried a number of ways to get out of the loop, including driving in reverse, but the highway behind her was the same as the highway ahead, an endless repetition of the same mile of asphalt, and driving across the median to go in the opposite direction. But she was still traveling westbound toward mile marker 159, after several hours of being stuck in this situation. Trapped in the loop, Patricia started to notice minor changes in her cargo. The temperature monitoring system was displaying variations that shouldn't have been possible with the stable climate control settings. More unsettling was the sound, emanating from the cargo area, a low humming noise that seemed to pulse in time with the engine of her truck. The medical equipment wasn't acting as it should have, and when Patricia checked the cargo bay, she found that the crates holding the medical equipment were glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed in time with the humming noise. The pharmaceutical company had been purposefully evasive about the precise nature of the medical devices, referring to them only as diagnostic equipment in the shipping documents, but the complex loading procedures and the extreme security measures suggested that the cargo was far more significant than routine medical supplies. Patricia was convinced that the glow had not been present when the cargo was loaded, and as she watched, the glow seemed to be getting brighter and the pulsing more rapid. Her situation may be related to the experimental equipment she was hauling. The pulsing glow from the crates was now bright enough to illuminate the entire interior of her trailer, and the humming sound had become a steady vibration that she could feel through the truck's frame. Patricia attempted to call the pharmaceutical company using the emergency number they had provided, but her communication systems remained completely non-functional, and she was stuck in the temporal loop with cargo that seemed to be malfunctioning in ways that defied conventional understanding of medical equipment. As the hours went by, though Patricia was starting to wonder if time had any significance in her current circumstances, the psychological toll of the monotonous repetition started to take its toll. In addition to discovering that it took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds to go from mile marker 159 back to mile marker 159, regardless of her speed, Patricia also started to notice that she wasn't aging or growing tired in the typical way. She felt as alert and energetic as when she had started the loop, and her fuel gauge remained constant, showing 3 to 4 full no matter how long she drove. She found herself developing an obsessive attention to detail, memorizing every aspect of the repeating landscape and timing the exact intervals between landmarks. The most unsettling aspect of Patricia's experience was realizing that she might not be alone in the loop, as she started to see shadows in her peripheral vision, other cars that appeared to be on the same route but vanished when she tried to look at them directly. And she began to hear voices on her CB radio, faint transmissions from other drivers who appeared to be going through similar things. Even her truck's odometer had stopped moving, frozen at the exact reading it had shown when she first entered the loop. One trucker, whose name was Bobby, became a regular voice on Channel 19, claiming to have been stuck in his own loop for what he estimated to be several years. Bobby explained that he had been carrying similar experimental equipment when he got stuck, and that the cargo seemed to be creating some sort of temporal distortion field that isolated individual trucks in pocket dimensions. Bobby claimed that dozens of other drivers were stuck in similar loops across the nation, all of whom were carrying cargo from the same pharmaceutical company or its subsidiaries. Bobby warned Patricia that the longer she stayed in the loop, the harder it would be to get out. The temporal distortion was intended to study the effects of time manipulation on both humans and machinery, and the subjects were expected to eventually become permanently integrated into the experimental framework. The equipment they were transporting was not medical devices at all, but rather parts of an experimental time manipulation technology that the company was testing by using unwitting truckers as test subjects. Bobby himself had given up trying to escape and had accepted his fate as a test subject, and Patricia refused to accept Bob's fatalistic assessment and persisted in trying to find a way out of the loop, trying various driving patterns, damaging the cargo to interfere with the equipment's operation, and even trying to get out of her truck and flee on foot. But nothing worked. Everything she did led back to the same mile marker 159 and the same never-ending repetition. The breakthrough came when Patricia realized that the pharmaceutical company had installed monitoring equipment that was intended to interact with her truck's computer systems, creating a feedback loop that created the temporal field. Patricia was able to find and disconnect the monitoring device, and as soon as it shut down, she felt the disorienting sensation of time snapping back into normal flow, and the surrounding landscape appeared different, older, and more weathered, as if years had passed in the outside world while she was trapped in the loop. Patricia immediately called the authorities to report her experience, but when her GPS systems returned online, they showed that she was actually at mile marker 159. But the date display showed that 3 weeks had passed since she had first entered the temporal distortion. Investigators discovered that the pharmaceutical company's Ohio facility was abandoned, with no sign of the organization that had employed her. The company's registration documents were all fraudulent, and the medical equipment Patricia had been transporting had disappeared from her trailer during the escape from the temporal loop. The most disturbing finding was that Patricia wasn't the only driver to report this kind of experience. Over the previous 5 years, the FBI had received 17 similar reports from truckers who said they had been caught in temporal loops while transporting cargo for different pharmaceutical and research companies. In each case, the truckers had lost days or weeks of time, and the companies that had hired them had vanished without a trace. Patricia underwent a thorough medical and psychological evaluation to assess the effects of her experience, but doctors found no signs of injury to her, body or mind. She found that she could recall specifics of the loop with perfect clarity, as if the experience had been burned into her memory with supernatural precision, and that she was permanently changed. Patricia went back to trucking, but now she focuses on identifying and avoiding potentially dangerous cargo, and she has joined an informal network of drivers who share information about suspicious shipping companies and unusual delivery requirements. The FBI believes Patricia and the other affected drivers were test subjects in a large-scale experiment involving time manipulation, but the technology involved is beyond current scientific understanding. Patricia continues to receive occasional communications from Bobby and other drivers who claim to be trapped in temporal distortion, and she has learned to recognize the warning signs of experimental cargo that might pose risks beyond normal transportation hazards. The investigation into the pharmaceutical company and the temporal distortion technology is still ongoing, but authorities have not found any evidence of who was conducting the experiments or what their ultimate purpose might have been. The final, unsettling detail of Patricia's story is what happened to her truck after the incident. Although it had been kept in perfect condition prior to the temporal loop, her truck aged dramatically during the loops. These messages come through her CB radio at random intervals, usually late at night when she's driving through remote areas. The voices always warn her about new shipping companies and cargo types that might be connected to the experimental program, and they beg her to find a way to rescue them from their endless repetition. It was as though her truck had undergone normal time flow, while Patricia herself had been shielded by the temporal distortion, creating a discrepancy that served as tangible evidence of her impossible experience. Our ninth story, which comes from driver Kevin, involves something that every trucker takes for granted: their memories of the road. The engine had accumulated wear equivalent to several years of normal operation, the tires were worn down to dangerous levels, and various components showed signs of extreme age and stress. In August 2021, Kevin received an unusual contract through his dispatcher, a high-paying delivery job that required a driver with an impeccable safety record and the ability to handle confidential cargo. Transporting research materials from a biotechnology company in Virginia to what was described as a memory research facility in rural Montana. Martinez, a cross-country driver with 12 years of experience, was known for his exceptional memory and attention to detail. He could recall specific routes, truck stops, and road conditions from years earlier with photographic precision, a skill that made him valuable for hauling sensitive cargo that required absolute reliability and discretion. The pay was extraordinary, almost 4 times what Kevin would normally be paid, and the only conditions were that he keep all information about the cargo and its destination completely confidential. Kevin picked up the cargo at a state-of-the-art biotechnology facility outside of Richmond, where he was greeted by scientists in white lab coats who oversaw the loading of dozens of small containers containing what looked to be biological samples, which were stored in specialized refrigeration units that maintained precise temperature control, and Kevin was given comprehensive instructions about tracking the cargo status during the trip. What Kevin found unusual was when Kevin inquired about the unusual paperwork, the lead scientist explained that the research facility needed detailed background information about all drivers who delivered to their location, ostensibly for security clearance purposes. Kevin filled out the necessary forms and assessments, which included questions about his driving history, his ability to recall specific routes and experiences, and even questions about childhood memories and family history. Instead of the usual shipping documents, Kevin received a thick folder full of psychological assessment forms, memory evaluation tests, and what looked like brain scan images. Kevin started his journey westward, taking Interstate 64 through Virginia and Kentucky before connecting to Interstate 70 through Missouri and into Colorado. The first day of driving was completely normal, and Kevin made excellent time while carefully monitoring the temperature-controlled cargo. However, as he entered his second day on the road, Kevin started to experience something that he initially attributed to fatigue. The process took more than 2 hours, but Kevin assumed it was standard procedure for high-security research facilities and didn't question the unusual requirements. The memory lapses were minor at first, but as Kevin continued westward, they became more frequent. At first, he was proud of his ability to recall every detail of his trips, so when he realized that he couldn't remember passing through a particular town or taking a specific exit, it was immediately concerning because he had never experienced memory problems before. More importantly, he would be at truck stops and not remember how he got there or why he stopped. His logbook had entries in his own handwriting for things he couldn't recall, and his fuel receipts showed purchases he didn't remember making. It was as though parts of his journey were being erased from his memory as soon as they happened. Kevin tried calling his dispatcher to report the memory issues, but each time he tried to call, he forgot why he was calling before the number had finished dialing. His memory loss was getting so bad that he was starting to doubt his ability to drive his truck safely. It became really unsettling when Kevin realized that he was losing memories, not just of the current trip, but of his entire driving career. Truck stops where he had been a regular driver suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Routes that he had traveled hundreds of times suddenly seemed unfamiliar, and he would find his phone in his hand with no memory of picking it up, or that he had been in the middle of conversations that he couldn't remember starting. When Kevin pulled over at a rest area in Colorado to assess his situation, he found something that scared him. His normally meticulous logbooks, which he had kept for over 12 years, now contained entries he didn't remember writing and references to trips he couldn't recall taking. More troublingly, some of the entries described deliveries to the same Montana research facility he was currently traveling to. Delivery trips that Kevin had apparently made multiple times but had no memory of. Being a customer for years felt like places he had never seen before, as if his entire professional experience was being methodically erased from his mind. As Kevin dug deeper into his logbooks, he discovered that he had made dozens of trips to the Montana facility over the previous few years, each linked to the same kind of biological cargo he was now transporting, and each trip was accompanied by progressively more thorough medical and psychological evaluations. Based on his own records, Kevin had been routinely transporting materials to this facility and undergoing extensive testing, but he had no conscious memory of any of these prior deliveries. Kevin attempted to contact the biotechnology company that had employed him, but when he dialed the number on his contract, he found that it was disconnected. Kevin was starting to suspect that he might be involved in something far more sinister than a routine research delivery when he tried to use his phone to research the company online and found nothing, as if the organization had never existed. That night, as he was sleeping in his truck at a rest area in Utah, he was awakened by voices outside his cab and saw two people in white lab coats inspecting his truck and talking about his cargo through his window. In technical terms, he didn't understand. The researchers were discussing Kevin's memory extraction progress and noting that his cognitive baseline was deteriorating as they had anticipated. They were referring to Kevin as Subject 47 and mentioning that he was scheduled for final processing when he reached the Montana facility because one of them was taking notes on a clipboard and the other was apparently taking readings from some sort of electronic device pointed at Kevin's trailer. Kevin stayed perfectly still and listened to their conversation, which revealed the horrific truth about his situation. According to the conversation Kevin overheard, the research facility was developing technology to harvest and transfer human memories, particularly the specialized knowledge and experience of professional truckers. Previously, Kevin had been a test subject for experimental memory extraction technology, and the biological samples he was transporting were not research materials at all, but rather extracted memories and experiences from previous trucker subjects who had been processed at the Montana facility. Kevin's frequent visits to the facility had allowed researchers to gradually extract his memories of the road while replacing them with artificial experiences designed to keep him functioning as a driver. The trucking industry provided an ideal testing ground because drivers frequently worked alone and traveled long distances, making them easy to manipulate without detection. The researchers discussed Kevin's case specifically, noting that his exceptional memory and extensive driving experience made him a particularly valuable subject. They had been extracting his memories gradually over multiple trips to avoid detection, but they were now ready to finish the process by removing all of the memories. The extracted memories could then be implanted into other subjects or stored digitally for later use. The biological samples in his trailer were the extracted memories of other drivers who had undergone the same process, and Kevin was unwittingly transporting the stolen experiences of his fellow truckers to be stored or implanted into new subjects. Kevin realized that he was being transported to the facility not as a driver delivering cargo, but as cargo himself, a test subject scheduled for final memory extraction that would likely leave him in a vegetative state. Following the researchers' departure, Kevin started his truck and left the rest area, abandoning his planned route to the Montana facility. However, as he drove through the night, he found that his memory problems were getting worse very quickly, losing memories of recent events within minutes of their occurrence, and his knowledge of road navigation and trucking procedures was rapidly deteriorating to the point where he was no longer safe to drive. Kevin was able to get to a hospital in Salt Lake City before his memory loss became completely incapacitating. Medical personnel were impressed by his story but were concerned by how quickly his symptoms were progressing. While Kevin was being evaluated at the hospital, investigators found that his truck's cargo was, in fact, biological material, but it wasn't stored in normal preservation medium. The samples were suspended in a synthetic fluid that contained complex neural networks and what appeared to be digitized brain activity patterns. Each container held what researchers described as crystallized memories that could potentially be transferred to other subjects under the right conditions. Brain scans showed unusual patterns of neural activity that were consistent with artificial memory manipulation, but the technology involved was beyond anything currently found in the medical literature. Kevin's condition stabilized after several weeks of treatment, but his memory never fully recovered. The investigation into the memory extraction operation uncovered a sophisticated network involving several biotechnology companies and research facilities across the nation, where truckers were being systematically targeted and recruited for fictitious delivery jobs that allowed researchers to study their memories and gradually extract their accumulated knowledge and experience. The ultimate goal seemed to be the creation of a database of human memories that could be accessed and utilized for various purposes, kept his personal memories and some basic living skills, but all of his professional trucking knowledge was gone. He was unable to recall how to drive a commercial vehicle. felt unfamiliar with the industry he had worked in for more than 10 years, and he was unaware of its origins or rules. 12 years of his existence seemed to have been surgically excised from his consciousness. Finding out how many other drivers had been impacted by the memory extraction program was the most unsettling part of Kevin's case. Data from hospitals across showed that dozens of drivers had experienced unexpected beginning of memory loss, cognitive decline, and early dementia that were not attributable to common medical causes. Many of these drivers had a history of delivering goods to biotechnology companies or research centers that turned out to be non-existent. Although Kevin never went back to driving trucks, he is now an advocate for the rights and safety of drivers. He collaborates with law enforcement to find delivery requests and questionable shipping companies that may be linked to the memory extraction network. Additionally, he participates in a support group for drivers who have gone through unexplained memory loss, with many sharing similar accounts of enigmatic research facilities and phony delivery employment. Although the memory extraction operation is still being investigated, officials have had difficulty identifying the program's creators or locating the primary research center. When Kevin failed to show up as planned, the Montana facility he was supposed to deliver to was discovered deserted, with signs that it had been quickly evacuated. Investigators discovered proof of the memory extraction processes in the form of specialized chairs with neural interface devices, even though the technology and equipment had been removed. Even now, Kevin continues to get messages from people who seem to be other memory extraction software victims. Drivers who claim to be suffering from memory loss and uncertainty regarding deliveries they can't recall making are calling to leave these messages. The symptoms Kevin has are often exactly the same as those described by the callers. Additionally, they often note that they have contracts for delivery to research institutes that are not listed in any formal documents. When detectives examined the biological samples from Kevin's truck, they found the last terrifying piece in his account. The containers held crystalline memories that were not only arbitrary extracts. In particular, they were chosen recollections pertaining to driving experience, route acquaintance, and trucking understanding. Every sample reflected years of professional experience that had been prepared for transfer to new subjects after being stolen from its original owner. Investigators discovered memories belonging to drivers who had been reported missing throughout the previous 5 years among the samples. Their memories were reportedly being saved and exchanged like commodities in a black market for human experience, and these men and women had vanished while delivering to various research centers. The ramifications imply that the memory extraction program was a business venture intended to gather and sell human memory, not merely an experiment, the highest bidder's expertise. Because of Kevin's case, the trucking industry is now more aware of the dangers of taking delivery contracts from unreliable businesses. However, the memory extraction network is still up and running. In addition to reporting any unusual medical or psychological tests needed for shipping employment, drivers are now urged to confirm the legality of research institutions and biotechnology companies before accepting delivery contracts. However, detection is quite challenging due to the operation's complex nature and capacity to build convincing bogus companies. Our 10th tale leads us to what may be the finest unsettling story in this compilation. It also includes a revelation that will cause you to wonder who every trucker you see on the road is. Michael Torres, a long-haul driver with 14 years of experience who was well known in the industry for his dependability and professional reputation, provided this account. A plot so heinous that it calls into question our fundamental beliefs about human identity and the nature of awareness itself would be exposed by Michael's experience. Michael was hired to carry what seemed to be a standard medical supply from a pharmaceutical distribution center in Arizona to a private medical institution in northern Arizona in December 2021. Alaska. The job's peculiarity was its remote location. Only one dirt road requiring special permissions and winter driving equipment led to the site, which was more than 200 miles from the closest town. The great seclusion and harsh winter conditions justified the unusual remuneration, which was almost 10 times Michael's usual rate. In addition to having the required emergency supplies and cold weather gear for the trip, Michael had prior experience making distant deliveries in Alaska. The shipment included what the shipping documentation referred to as biological research, along with medical supplies and equipment that were enclosed in temperature-controlled containers. materials that needed to be handled carefully and have exact environmental controls. Michael wasn't overly worried about the odd nature of the delivery because he has previously delivered similar stuff. Michael was surprised by the length of the pickup procedure at the Arizona facility. Michael had to go through a thorough medical examination that included blood testing, brain scans, and in-depth psychological evaluations in addition to packing the luggage. The medical personnel clarified that because of biosecurity rules and the delicate nature of the research being done there, these procedures were necessary for anyone accessing the Alaska facility. Although Michael believed the medical examination was routine for high-security research sites, he thought it was particularly extensive and intrusive. His physical attributes were measured in depth, his speech patterns were analyzed, and even genetic testing, including several tissue samples, was part of the investigation. Although the entire procedure took more than 8 hours, Michael was reassured by the medical staff that the results would be completed prior to his arrival to the Alaska facility. Driving through Nevada, Idaho, and Canada before entering Alaska, Michael started his adventure north. The first few days of the trip were uneventful, and Michael managed to get by in spite of the harsher conditions, meteorological circumstances on his Arctic journey. However, Michael started to hear strange radio transmissions on his CB as he got closer to the last part of his trip, the 200-mile gravel route to the research center. The broadcasts were technical exchanges between individuals who appeared to be keeping tabs on Michael's progress rather than the usual trucker banter. His whereabouts, the state of his goods, and even private information about his driving preferences and habits were all covered in length during the chats. The most upsetting thing was that instead of using Michael's name, the individuals on the radio referred to him by a number, subject M47. Michael attempted to react to the radio broadcasts, but the chats would end the moment he keyed his microphone. The surveillance appeared to be one way, as the unidentified observers followed Michael around at all times while staying out of sight of his communication attempts. During the loading procedure in Arizona, Michael started to think that his truck had been fitted with surveillance devices. The frequency and specificity of the radio messages increased as Michael got closer to the research site. While talking about Michael's compatibility grade, the observers pointed out that his baseline measures fit their specifications within reasonable bounds. Additionally, they stated that the integration team Alpha was waiting for Michael to arrive, and that the replacement method had been approved. None of these terms made sense to Michael. However, he became more uneasy due to the clinical tone of the conversations. He started to worry that he might be entering a position considerably more risky than a standard delivery, and that the medical check in Arizona had been more than just a security clearance. Michael contemplated reversing course and calling off the delivery. However, he was already too deep into the forest to safely turn back before finishing the trip. Michael had never seen anything like the actual research facility. Rather than being a typical medical center, the complex was made up of a number of connected buildings that were carved into the side of a mountain, with the majority of the institution seemingly located beneath security fences and guard towers around the heavily defended surface buildings. The whole place seemed more like a military installation than a medical research facility. Security guards greeted Michael at the gate of the complex, inspected his vehicle and its contents once again, and then let him travel to the loading dock. Technicians wearing complete biological containment suits oversaw the unloading procedure, and Michael had to wait in a special waiting area while his cargo was moved to the facility's internal systems. Michael heard facility employees discussing the horrifying reality of the research being done there while he waited for the cargo transfer to be accomplished. There was no involvement from the facility in any kind of medical research. Perfect. Replicas of specific people were being made at this cloning and replacement facility for uses that Michael could not fully understand based on the bits of talk he overheard. Michael had overheard that the facility had been producing and deploying hundreds of human copies effectively for a number of years. The new targets were carefully chosen on the basis of their social ties, professional expertise, and ability to access critical data or key places. Due to the fact that their itinerant lifestyle made their disappearances less noticeable, and that their familiarity with transportation networks could be used for a variety of illicit activities, truckers were especially desirable targets. To his increasing dismay, Michael discovered that he had not been contracted to transport goods to the establishment. They had enticed him there so that a copy could take his place. A thorough biological profile had been developed from the medical examination in Arizona, which would enable the facility to produce an ideal clone that would have all of his memories, abilities, and physical traits. It is likely that the biological research items he had carried were neural mapping, data and genetic samples from previously treated drivers. While in the waiting area, Michael learned that his truck had been disabled, preventing him from leaving the facility right away. He would have to stay tonight while final screening was finished, the facility security personnel explained pleasantly, but forcefully. Michael was led to what appeared to be guest accommodations, but it was actually a holding cell with no windows and reinforced doors. Michael could hear people moving through the hallways, machines running, and what sounded like assembly or construction work going on throughout the building at night. The voices he heard in nearby rooms were the most unsettling. He had never had talks with voices that sounded just like his own. Michael became aware that artificial memories were already being programmed into his clone, preparing it to replace him with ease. Michael found a maintenance access panel concealed behind a ventilation grate and used it to break out of his holding cell. He came upon something that will follow him around for the rest of his life as he passed through the facility's service corridors. Human clones in different stages of development are housed in dozens of growth chambers. Truck drivers, public servants, and corporate executives were among the individuals whose information was labeled with specifics for each chamber. What Michael discovered in the facility's storage sections was the most terrifying. Hundreds were containers containing what seemed to be human remains that had been thrown. The labels on the canisters stated that these were the original biological materials of individuals whose duplicates had successfully replaced them. It wasn't just clones that the factory was producing. The original people were being methodically killed, and their bodies were being disposed away. Michael found his truck in the facility's garage after the replacement procedure was finished, and he learned that it had been fitted with extra monitoring and control devices that would enable the facility to follow and control his activities in the event that his duplicate was activated. Additionally, he discovered proof that numerous other truck drivers had made deliveries to this facility over the years, and that their vehicles had undergone comparable modifications prior to their replicas being released back into the public. By causing a distraction in the power distribution system that momentarily turned off the security systems, Michael was able to get out of the building. Driving out of the facility, he observed search crews being sent to retake him, but he managed to avoid capture and make it to civilization thanks to his understanding of driving in harsh winter conditions. Michael reported his encounter to federal authorities right away. However, the ensuing investigation was both frightening and disappointing. The site was just an abandoned research station that had been quickly evacuated when law enforcement agencies tried to find it. All traces of the cloning procedure had been eliminated, and the complex's underground areas had been sealed with explosives, demolished. When investigators started following up with other drivers who had delivered to distant locations in previous years, they found the most unsettling information. After returning from their deliveries, more than 40 drivers who had taken comparable lucrative gigs to remote areas showed minor behavioral and mental changes. These drivers appeared unusual in ways that were hard to describe but impossible to ignore, according to family members and close friends. These drivers' medical checks showed abnormalities that were compatible with sophisticated cloning techniques. Brain scans revealed neuronal patterns that implied artificial memory implantation, while DNA tests revealed minuscule genetic markers that shouldn't have been present in spontaneously produced persons. The majority of the impacted drivers claimed to be the same individuals they had always been and had no recollection of anything out of the ordinary about their deliveries. Although Michael was genetically legitimate after undergoing a rigorous testing process, investigators cautioned him that his copy was most likely still in use elsewhere. In addition to artificially inserted experiences intended to fill in the memory gap, the clone would possess all of Michael's memories up until the time of the medical checkup in Arizona. In addition to working in the trucking sector and having access to all of Michael's professional relationships and reputation, the replica would be almost identical to Michael. The cloning and replacement scheme was much larger than first thought, according to the report. It was thought that similar facilities could be found in isolated areas of North America and possibly the world. The initiative seemed linked to organized crime groups that were infiltrating government organizations, transportation networks, and other key societal sectors by using fictitious people. Immediately following his escape, Michael quit trucking. It currently collaborates with federal agencies to find further victims of the replacement scheme and spot any cloning operations. In order to safeguard his identity and stop his replica from taking on his relationships and way of life, he has also undergone a number of security precautions. Michael uses several types of identification to demonstrate his legitimacy to family and friends while living under continual observation. The lingering question of how many people in different professions have been secretly replaced by copies is the most unsettling part of Michael's story. The Alaska facility's technology was decades ahead of what was understood to be possible in terms of cloning, indicating that the replacement program has been in effect for a lot longer than the investigators thought. Other truck drivers are still reporting suspicious delivery jobs and odd medical exams needed for some contracts to Michael. According to these allegations, the replacement program is still in effect and still targets professional drivers for unclear reasons. According to some investigations, the trucking business is being infiltrated on a regular basis as part of a bigger scheme to take over supply chains and transportation networks. What transpired when Michael attempted to resume his regular life following the incident is the last unsettling aspect of his experience. Even though he spoke and looked just like Michael, some of his long-standing trucking contacts claimed to have received visits from someone posing as him who knew specifics about his previous experiences and occupations that the actual Michael had never had. It appears that his replica was working in the trucking industry, presumably accepting jobs and establishing connections that might one day grant access to vital transportation networks or sensitive cargo. Because of Michael's situation, the trucking industry is now more conscious of the dangers of taking delivery contracts to isolated or distant locations, particularly those that call for stringent security clearances or medical exams. But the advanced because of the replacement program's nature and capacity to produce flawless replicas, detection is quite challenging. The initiative poses a risk to the safety and integrity of the whole transportation sector, not just to individual truckers. Although federal officials are still looking into the replacement program, the distant locations and advanced security measures used by the firms running the facilities have made it difficult to find more. The initiative seems to be run and supported by organizations with unrestricted finances and access to cutting-edge technology, indicating ties to either foreign governments or very successful criminal organizations with capabilities that go against what we think is feasible from a scientific standpoint. We reach the most unsettling story in this collection with our 11th and last story. Additionally, there is a revelation that links all of the earlier tales in ways that will cause you to reevaluate your assumptions about the American transportation system. Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned long-haul driver with 18 years of experience, provides this perspective. She unintentionally came across components from each of the stories we've discussed tonight. Through her journey, Sarah would uncover the terrifying reality that connects all of the mysterious and eerie occurrences that truckers see on America's worst roadways. A dispatcher Sarah had never worked with before called her in November 2022 and offered her the highest-paying contract of her career. The task was to move what were referred to as archival research materials from a Nevada storage facility to a location that would be supplied to her en route. The remuneration for a single delivery was outrageous, nearly $50,000. However, the contract contained odd provisions that required complete confidentiality and prohibited her from talking to anybody about the cargo or destination. The pickup site was a huge warehouse complex in the Nevada desert that was only reachable by several checkpoints and encircled by military-style security. Before being brought to the loading dock, Sarah had to sign documents she couldn't read and go through a rigorous background check. Hundreds of file boxes, computer servers, and what looked like biological preservation equipment were among the cargo. Sarah's blood ran cold as she heard the facility staff having a chat while the cargo was being loaded. They were talking about Project Night Road, an ongoing initiative that had been gathering information on inexplicable phenomena, dimensional incursions, and supernatural encounters along America's highway system for more than 30 years. Sarah heard that every weird encounter recorded by truckers was not only true, but also a part of a planned experiment carried out by a group with unrestricted resources and technology that the general public was unaware of. The archived materials contain documentation of thousands of trucker encounters with ghosts, time loops, phantom truck stops, and other supernatural phenomena. The loading supervisor, who was evidently not aware that Sarah could hear him, said to a colleague, "However, these were not isolated incidents. They were well-planned assessments intended to examine how regular individuals handled impossibly difficult situations, circumstances. The group had been testing experimental technology that could control time, memory, reality, and human awareness in the trucking sector." It dawned on Sarah that she was doing more than simply moving research files. Evidence of the largest psychological and paranormal experiment in human history was with her. This initiative had included every ghost encounter story, phantom location report, and driver missing account. For decades, the group had been routinely frightening truckers while gathering information on people's reactions to trauma caused by the paranormal. An encrypted communication system that had been put in Sarah's truck during loading provided her with her destination coordinates as she set off on her voyage. Within 72 hours, she was supposed to be at a facility in the Colorado mountains. However, Sarah started to have aspects of every otherworldly experience she had ever heard other truckers talk about as she drove through the night. Sarah first came across our introductory story's phantom convoy. 3 trucks started to follow her across after showing up in her mirrors. Nevada, keeping excellent formation and reacting with remarkable accuracy to her adjustments in speed. Sarah heard the voices of truckers who had been gone for decades when she attempted to reach them on her CB radio. They were all pleading with her to turn around and forego her delivery. Sarah came across the incorrect exit scenario as she entered Utah. As she traveled through a landscape that seemed to change and evolve, her GPS started pointing her in the direction of roads that weren't shown on any map. People in nightgowns watched her vehicle with hunger as she passed deserted communities. Eyes. She also heard individuals on her radio talking about the state of the roads decades ago. The drive across Colorado increased the psychological strain on Sarah. She picked up a hitchhiker who looked like a young woman in need but turned out to be something horrible with pointed teeth and black eyes. The hitchhiker informed Sarah that she was getting close to the origin of all the paranormal activity that afflicted the roads of America, an institution that was testing and manipulating reality itself. The cargo behind Sarah's truck began to move and make noises, causing the sealed container phenomenon. Investigating further, she found that the files in the archives were strangely alive and contained actual supernatural beings that had been captured in addition to records of paranormal experiences. For their studies on human subjects, the group had been trapping ghosts, demons, and other paranormal creatures. Sarah came upon the 24-hour truck stop that only existed in otherworldly space as she got closer to the Colorado plant. The imaginary truck stop looked precisely like other drivers had told her about it, including the enigmatic gadgets that would be fitted on her vehicle and the amiable employees who made an effort to persuade her to stay. Sarah understood that this was a processing facility where the group trained drivers for paranormal experiences and tracked their reactions. Sarah was informed by the truck stop employees that she had been chosen to serve as Project Night Road's last test subject. In addition to delivering the archived files, she was the ideal candidate for the ultimate experiment because of her 18 years of driving expertise and her stellar reputation for dependability. A test that would ascertain if the company's technology for manipulating reality was prepared for widespread use. Sarah found that this institution was linked to every supernatural experience she had ever heard about. Drivers were caught in haunting objects by the vintage delivery, the Channel 19 voice that issued warnings from the afterlife. That non-human passenger, drivers were caught in time loops by the endless mile. Drivers' experiences were stolen by the memory facility and the replacement software that produced flawless copies. These were all distinct facets of a single, enormous experiment. Project Night Road's group did more than merely research paranormal activity. They were developing it with technology that fused captured supernatural beings with cutting-edge science. They had been pushing the boundaries of reality manipulation and human consciousness. The ultimate objective was to create the capacity to manipulate human memory and perception on a large scale, maybe impacting entire populations. Sarah discovered that the building she was getting close to was the main headquarters for all paranormal activity on the roads of America. From this site, every phantom place, every ghost truck, and every impossible encounter was planned utilizing a combination of trapped supernatural creatures and cutting-edge technology. In essence, the group had weaponized the paranormal, using it as a means of observing and influencing human behavior. Sarah made a choice that might potentially save the lives of numerous other drivers, in addition to her own, as she approached the facility's last turn. Rather than providing, Sarah drove her truck straight into the main building of the facility, destroying decades of study data and releasing hundreds of trapped supernatural creatures. Sarah had brought archived files to the facility. The whole highway system felt the unearthly shockwave caused by the facility's demolition. Time loops broke down, phantom truck stops vanished, and trapped spirits were at last released to continue on to whatever happens after death. Truckers around the country observed the abrupt halt in supernatural activity on America's highways, stating that for the first time in decades the roads felt normal. Despite being seriously hurt, Sarah spent months recuperating in a guarded medical facility after surviving the explosion. When federal investigators debriefed her during her recuperation, they disclosed that Project Night Road had been the subject of a years-long inquiry. However, traditional research had been rendered difficult by the organization's employment of technology for reality modification and otherworldly creatures. Law enforcement had made the breakthrough they needed to uncover the organization thanks to Sarah's demolition of the facility. The full extent of Project Night Road was discovered during the ensuing investigation. With facilities on every continent, the organization had been functioning with financial support from several governments. Pilots, ship captains, train engineers, and other transportation professionals around the world have been impacted by their experiments, in addition to truck drivers. Developing the capacity to manipulate human memory and awareness as a means of social and political control was the aim. Although the organization's operations had been hampered by Sarah's valiant acts, investigators cautioned that other facilities were still operational and that other groups might potentially use the technology created through Project Night Road. Even though the paranormal experiences that had terrified truckers for decades are no longer happening, the human groups responsible for them still constitute a threat to personnel in the transportation industry and the general public. You're now among the select few who are aware of the reality of what actually occurs on American roads if you've read this far. However, this need not be the end of your adventure into proven terror. We have many more true stories that are as unsettling as the ones you heard tonight. So if you haven't already, subscribe to Verified Fears immediately. We provide you with verifiable stories of actual horror every week that will make you reevaluate your assumptions about the world. To ensure you don't miss any uploads, click the notification bell. Because if you ever find yourself in a similar position, the information in these stories may save your life. Power comes from knowledge, and that information can mean the difference between being a victim and surviving in the realm of verifiable terror. If you work as a truck driver or know someone who works in the transportation sector, please forward this video to them. These tales are more than just amusement. These are cautionary tales from other drivers who have survived the unimaginable. The trucking community is protective of one another. Additionally, sharing knowledge about the threats that lie on our highways is part of that protection. If you've heard anything like this tonight, please leave a comment below. Every tale we get is looked into by Verified Fears, and your account might alert other travelers to risks they were unaware of. Your story matters whether you're a truck driver, a tourist, or just someone who has experienced something inexplicable. To assist others in finding these verified accounts, please like this video. Of actual fear. Uncomfortable truths are not always given preference by the algorithm. Therefore, your participation helps guarantee that those who need to hear these crucial warnings do so. Additionally, keep in mind that if you ever drive alone, if something doesn't feel right at night, follow your gut. In the transportation industry, sadly, paranoia is not a medical condition. It is a skill for survival. Because they paid attention to their inner warning, the drivers who told us their tales tonight were able to live them when something wasn't right. Remain alert, keep secure, and keep in mind that assuming what you're seeing is what you're seeing is the most perilous thing you can do on America's darkest highways. Is typical. Because normal is frequently simply a facade, as these 11 instances have demonstrated. That conceals something far darker. This has been confirmed to be a fear, where every story is confirmed and every nightmare is genuine. Till the next time, maintain your radio set to channel 19, your doors closed and your eyes on the road. You never know when you might require assistance from a fellow traveler who is aware that occasionally the most crucial luggage, the reality of what actually occurs in the shadows between locations. Be careful when you drive. The road is observing.